Well, thank you, and I start with apologies to Dickens, but okay, it's the best we can do. I'm a geologist. My literary review is kind of limited. I'm trying to bring a different perspective to the discussions you guys are carrying on here, because they're really important, but there's another filter that gets thrown in, and that's the public health filter. And it's not just about nitrate levels and being high, but it is about how do we filter into the discussion of where solutions lie by bringing in the public health piece in a manner that doesn't necessarily force us to choose over agriculture and public health. And so that's what I'd like to share with you today. An experience that Washington has, in that we have two communities located in the state that have been dealing with this issue and have had different patterns towards success and different levels of success. So to start with, I'm with the Washington State Department of Health, and our offices, we manage the regulation of public water supplies across the state, but we also have a responsibility to provide health education and outreach and technical support for all the consumers who drink water in the state. So our mission is a broader one than those that we regulate. And we have partners in this endeavor. It's not just a regular state Tory. Most local health jurisdictions, which is a county jurisdiction, have the ultimate authority for regulating public health activities. And so we work with them. And of course, I don't deliver one drop of clean water anywhere in the state of Washington. That is a utility, a local water supply, or an individual with a well. In the state of Washington, we regulate over 17,000 public water supplies. Of that, 4,000 fall under the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act, and that establishes a maximum contaminant level for nitrate as nitrogen is 10 milligrams per liter. So that's the reference point that we use for what is safe and reliable. It needs to be below that level under the federal regulation, and we impose the same standard when we apply it to those things that are regulated at the state level. So 4,000 fall under the federal regulation, 13,000 fall under the state regulation. The level of regulation is very different between the two levels. And then we have a number of private who's our public water supply wells that are private. So if you think in terms of population, about 6 million people drink public water from federally regulated systems. About 130,000 drink it from those 13,000 small public water systems. We're talking 2 and 3 to 10 connection kind of things, very small. But almost 1 million residents in the state of Washington drink water from their own well. And most of those are groundwater sources. Most of the population being served, another piece of the picture, in Washington we are fortunate we have very good water quality for most of it. The vast majority of the population drinking public water can get it from about 200 systems who have surface water supplies. And we don't have nitrate issues in most of our surface water supplies from a drinking water standpoint. But over 60% of the water systems in the state rely on groundwater. So you have that, do I serve the large portion of the population or do I serve the portion of water systems? And so we have that dilemma, which I'm sure everyone else experiences at some level. Well, as I said, we have good water quality. We have a very low incidence of anthropogenic contaminants at any kind of safety level for our public water supplies throughout most of those. But we do have 2 exceptions, and that includes arsenic, which is for the most part a naturally occurring contaminant at those levels in our state. And it's a small percentage, but there are local areas that's an issue. But the other one is nitrates. And this map represents the sources, public water sources, that have detected in 2014 nitrate above half the MCL, those are the gray dots, or above the 10 milligram per liter threshold, which are the red dots. So it's not just in the 2 counties I'm going to talk about, but it does affect all over, and the implications are significant, and they have costs that are being borne by water systems on a regular basis, both from monitoring and treatment. And as with many times you deal with environmental consequences, the person who pays for remediation may not be the person who has control over the sources of contamination, and that is always a challenge. And that's why looking at things at the community level becomes so important, because it is where some of those solutions may be found. So I'm going to look at 2 areas in particular. This is the state of Washington. Up in our northwest corner near the Canadian border, I'm going to talk about the Abbottsford Sumas or Whatcom County aquifer system. And in the lower eastern side, cross over our mountains into our eastern side of the state, I'm going to talk about the Yakima, which is the Lower Yakima Valley groundwater management area. Interestingly enough, we in Washington tend to think of ourselves as very schizophrenic. We have the wet west side and the dry east side. But when you look at these two watersheds, there's a number of things that are very similar about them. Population-wise, they are about the same, about 250,000 plus or minus for the two. As I said, one of the issues that we deal with in both cases is we have transboundary issues. In the Abbottsford Sumas, it's literally the Canadian boundary, and half the watershed lives on the Canadian side, and the other half is on the southern side, and the water is flowing into the U.S. We also have tribal interests in the Nooksack, in the Nooksack Basin. We have the Lummi and the Nooksack tribes, which in the state of Washington we're dealing with on a government-to-government basis. It's a separate. In the Lower Yakima, while we're not near any foreign border, we do have a significant portion of the basin that is part of the treaty lands for the Yakima Indian Nation. And again, we have tribal treaty relationships and sovereignty issues about how we manage the state of Washington. Local governments don't get to decide what happens on treaty tribal lands and vice versa, although, so we have to find ways to cooperate. Other challenging issues between the two, both of them are, let's see if we get a picture here. Both of them have snow-dominated mountain portions of their hydrology that provide a significant amount of snowmelt to the stream flows and the groundwater recharge in each basin. The difference between the two happens to be, besides east and west, is that there's about 36 inches of rain in Whatcom County and about 10 inches of rain a year in Yakima County. So while there are similarities, there are differences. The other part, both of the two counties represent significant dairy production for the state, some of the top producers in the state, very productive, and associated industries. So we talk about the cows and the forelegs, but in both of these counties, these are agricultural communities as well, and they have a number of associated industries for food production, food packaging, processing, and related that contribute to the local economies. In the Whatcom County, Abbottsford Sumas side, we have more larger communities, both on the Canadian side and on the Washington side, that are not dependent on groundwater, that are urban and require and use surface water. And the biggest example is in Whatcom County. It is the town of Bellingham, one of our larger communities. On the Yakima side, while we have the city of Yakima and a number of other municipalities, they are all tied heavily to agricultural practices within the region, and they are many of them are groundwater dependent. And so it's a little different dynamic and demographics. But dairies, raspberries, berries, and seed potatoes in the Abbottsford Sumas or Whatcom, and in the Lower Yakima, dairies, orchards, hops, and wine grapes, amongst a host of other production in both. I don't mean to give short shrift to either. Manure production and use of manure is important in both environments, and the management of manure becomes a significant challenge for the communities that are dealing with nitrate issues. In Whatcom County, a study by the Department of Ecology that looked at sampling of private wells in the area of the northwestern Whatcom County, that they had, I think, between 20 and 25% of the private wells were showing elevated nitrate levels. These are generally small wells, small communities, small family. In Yakima, the county had undertaken a broader investigation, and in the area that becomes the groundwater management area, between 12 and 15% were showing an elevated level of nitrates above the safe drinking water level. Now remember, we don't regulate all of these, but I can't in good conscience turn to someone who gets their water from a municipal supply and say above 10 is not good, and turn to a private homeowner and tell them it's okay to be drinking 11 or 15 milligrams per liter nitrate. So the message, I may not have a regulatory authority, but I absolutely have a public health responsibility to talk about how they can be smarter and about managing those risks. Okay. So looking at Abbottsford Sumas, it's not coming up. Okay, well, so much for that plan. I'll go to the next slide. There we go. This was supposed to show you all the little lovely things that showed up in the time. It started with boil water notices In the case of nitrate, we don't do boil water notice, but we do health advisories. If the nitrate levels are exceeded, within 24 hours, the water systems are to notify their customers that they are to find an alternative source of supply until the nitrate levels can be brought down or treatment can be put online. And in many cases, treatment is blending. It got in the news. There are associated challenges with agriculture in any community. They get in the news too, and they affect how the Abbottsford Sumas community got together. We've been dealing with this for over 25 years. I came to the Department of Health 25 years ago, and there was a nitrate challenge in the northern Whatcom County, and they're still dealing with it. There was one in Yakima when I came in, and they're still working with it. These are not short-term challenges. In the Yakima area, and I take that back. So there's a few glitches here. All right. So one of the outcomes was that the Abbotsford portion, which is the Canadian side, actually developed aquifer protection areas as a result of some of the initial challenges that were brought up. In the beginning, as with most of these, everybody was pointing to somebody else. The nitrates must be coming from Canada. No, the nitrates are coming, down here. It's chickens, it's cows, it's berries, you name it. And until they brought together believe it or not, an international task force. In the lower Yakima Valley, we had a number of public articles that came up and talked about the contaminated water supplies of private citizens and their struggles to finding any response from the regulations. As a result of the media coverage and local issues, coalitions were brought together, the local governments met with state agencies and the public, and we talked through what were the best options to move ahead so that both safe water and the other could be, agriculture and safe water can coexist. So here's some of the highlights of what came out of the local initiatives. I'm going to move ahead. We developed in the Whatcom County the Abbottsford Sumas International Task Force. In the Yakima, it was a groundwater management area that we've used a tool before, and it was taken on by the local government as the lead entity. In the Abbottsford Sumas, we have advisory committees. It is, again, provincial and state sponsors. Its local governments are included. Agricultural community is part of there. The universities, the tribes participate as observers. In the Guama, in the groundwater management area, the difference is it's led by a local coalition. The local governments took the lead, and most notably the county. There are citizens groups, there are ag community, there are state agencies, federal partners, universities, and tribal participation. It's a structured program based on a state regulation that authorizes these. So in the Abbottsford Sumas, it's a top-down approach. As I said, it was an international task force marginally under the auspices of the International Joint Treaty Commission. It's also sponsored by the provincial government and the state government. The goal was for reducing nitrates and improving farm practices. In the Yakima, it's a locally driven program, and its goals were, it has a defined advisory board that says you need to invite these people, and that's how you set up the process. And the goal is driven by preserving and protecting drinking water resources, which is an interesting distinction I'm going to suggest. As you can see, the ad hoc approach of the International Committee has limited funding, partnerships. They do have active partnerships with extension and communities and universities. No clear funding source or monitoring program. So whatever's done is done through existing programs. And there's very limited assistance for those water supplies that have been impacted by nitrates, and no resources for the privates. But it does work to raise awareness about the shared resource across the border. In the Yakima, it was a different approach. The goal is, it is funded directly. There was a large source of money to get this initiated and to implement, funded by the legislature. It has the lead with a contract with our local jurisdictions, the local government, and they have to develop a management plan and then develop implementation recommendations. And there's a time limit and a limit of funding. One of the focuses of this particular group has been a really aggressive program for education and outreach to the affected communities. Who's at risk? The water is, if you don't have safe water, here's what that sounds like, and here are the choices you can make to make your family have access to clean and safe water. Nobody's pretending the water is going to be fixed in the short term. But it did actually provide some access to reverse osmosis treatment devices. and a lot of information about tracking the data locally that they collect. Some of the successes in the Abbottsford Sumas, they do seem to have a pretty active program between the agricultural community and many of the research programs that are interested in this. And so they have developed a relationship and are working on farm-specific applications. There are periodic conferences across the border to share information and research. It's built on common points of agreement with the support of the International Commission, but no specific plan or direction for what the endpoint looks like. And public water systems are monitoring drinking water and must implement treatment in order to protect their customers. On the Yakima side, it's a little bit different. It's robust community participation with conflicts and progress being managed up front and in your face. Groundwater Framework provides a format for the state and local actions to be implemented. It has obligations for monitoring and reporting of their successes and their quarterly output. It has an active bilingual and public outreach program, actually aggressive, I'd say, because it's really out there. Groundwater monitoring and deep soil sampling are part of the initial development pieces that they're doing right now to try to find what the science pieces of this are versus the public education. And it is, and state agencies are to be at the table participating as receptors. You know, we're supposed to be listening. So, challenges. There's no single vision in the Abbottsford Sumas. The implementation is piecemeal and relies on existing state policies. Work is being done, good work is being done. It's just hard to measure where they are on the progress. I'll let you read some of the other pieces. What you can contrast with over in the Yakima Valley, and I think the challenges are everybody's in the room, there is no shortage of conflict. It requires continued legislative support until the implementation plan is there. And we've heard about it before, and you'll hear more. The fear of liability and enforcement has absolutely been a part of it. There have been court cases, and as a result of the court cases, actions have taken place on a whole bunch of players. The pace is frustrating for many of the players, and building and maintaining trust is a constant workload for the local entities that manage it. Everybody is watching. It's incredibly public. Come on. Hello. There we go. Too far. I'm going to go to the public lessons learned, because some of the innovations were here. One of the things that we saw was that there was a clear set of universal goals that were identified early on. And they were that access to safe and reliable drinking water for the community was one of the immediate priorities. But it was at the same time for support of efficient and sustainable agricultural communities. They're not choices they have to choose between. They have to find a way to meet them both. There is an active local sponsor. He happens to be in this room. He's part of the county commissioner's force who said we're going to find solutions. All stakeholders have skin in the game in the Yakima. Nobody wins if we don't come up with a solution. There's no incentive for the status quo to remain the same forever, and that makes a huge difference. And they've cultivated the political partners that can support a long-term solution for the community level. Planning and implementation, they're not the same thing, but they both have to be tied directly to local capacity and goals. And last, and this is probably the most important one, you have to talk about your successes publicly and constantly in order to keep the support both at the local level and above. And I appreciate your patience, and I'm done. And it's your lunchtime.
Thank you, Ginny. It's very interesting to see that there's, in one state in the United States, there's so many differences between local communities.
Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I have a question.
Yes.
You made the comparison, and the comparison was not only the approach, the top-down and the bottom-up, but there was also the difference in budget.
Yes.
And what was striking to me was that the bottom-up approach, as far as I could see, had more budget than the top-down approach.
That's absolutely true. The top-down approach was established at the governor to provincial governor level and said, let's go have a task force and look at this issue, and no perennial source of funding or immediate source.
Okay, but that really fascinates me, because usually if with a top-down approach comes a whole bucket of money. And
You'd think.
the bottom-up approach is usually, let's say, trying to get together and trying to make steps together, etc., but without any money. So where does the money come from?
There is actually state statute and legislation for the formation and initiation of what are called groundwater management areas in our state. They may be somewhat analogous to the sustainable groundwater areas that that California's talked about. These came up mostly in the 80s, and they were first and foremost for quantity, but over the time they've been expanded to be used, and it establishes a funding to provide local support for locally developed management plans.
Very small question. With all the parties involved, I was just curious, who has the final responsibility to provide people clean drinking water? Like, for instance, what happened in Flint, Michigan.
That actually,
I mean, it's different, but I was just curious, like, do people here have a right, or who is the final responsible?
for an individual who has a private well, it is ultimately that individual's responsibility to ensure that the water coming into their house is safe. If you have a public water supply, it falls on the water utility, and it's my job and my agency's job to assist them in meeting that demand. And it's the private partnership. So when we have systems who fail at the nitrate level, that utility, that community has to come up with the money to pay for treatment, which is one of the challenges. In Whatcom County, there are some small water systems, 25 to 35 connections, that are looking at centralized treatment. The price of water goes through the ceiling when you look at that. And they may or may not be directly involved in the generation of the contaminants of concern. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.